Snaptech IT is the expert go-to resource for all things CMMC, education, certification, preparation, and ongoing managed IT. Manage, secure, grow. Check it out at snaptechit.com.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of 123 CMMC. My name is Dana. I will be your host, and our guest is once again Karl Bickmore. Hello, Karl. How are you?
I'm well, thanks, Dana. How are you?
Good. Here's a topic that I would have assumed would have already talked about with everything going on with the pandemic starting, but we haven't, so we're going to talk about it now. Working remote offsite. So today, we're talking about the CMMC requirements for that. So our first question is, what is the CMMC requirement for access control, the capability domain that includes remote system access?
Yeah, right. Well, that's an excellent topic. Dana, I think that everybody knows that remote work is here to stay, and it gets even trickier when you have access to things like controlled and classified information or just other proprietary data that needs to be protected. But even beyond the compliance requirements, the security changes that need to happen just to make sure you're not opening yourself up to unnecessary risk. But so to answer the question, look, when you're doing CMMC for access control or remote access, I think the key things are, one, the system has to be clearly defined, meaning you need to have diagrams, you need to understand the data flow, you need to understand who does and doesn't have access to internal systems, and you must limit access. You got to operate with the least privileged principle, which means that only the people that absolutely require remote access can get in, or vendors. And when they get in, they can only get to specifically and only things that they need to, and in a secure way, right? And so this is about satisfying the controls around network access, around controlling authentication, and controlling your third-party vendors or others that may have access to your data. There's quite a few things that get wrapped up into access control and remote access when it comes to CMMC.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I could see this getting very tricky, especially if you have a lot of employees that are all over the place in different locations, and then making sure that what they're doing at home or wherever they're working, which is probably at home, and how they're tapping into the system here. So I can see that getting a little.
Well, it could be from home. Maybe it's from their van and they're on YOLO. You never know. Somewhere in Yosemite. I don't know. It could be anywhere.
That's a good point. It could be anywhere. All right. So what is particularly tricky when it comes to third-party vendor security? This is a good one.
Well, so it's enough to try to control the security and access from a single computer, perhaps even a computer that your organization issues and controls and manages. But when it gets to third party, your control of that environment is now within the hands of your trusted third party. And so the trick is can those third party applications or vendors prove and operate at the same level of security that you need to achieve the level of CMMC that you're looking to achieve? If you're looking to be, for instance, a level 2 CMMC authorized organization, your third parties need to operate at that sime level. And so that's tricky. The other thing is you have to remember that if they have access, even if it's an IT company or something like that, they have access to your CUI data. They can potentially be a source of unsecure or attacks into your environment. For instance, last year's couple of major attacks, one against SolarWinds and one against the Kaseya management system. These are IT tools that third parties were operating inside of government-controlled entities with these tools, and breaches happen because of the risks associated with those IT tools run. So, and look, IT is not your only third-party vendor, but it's one of the more dangerous ones that you have to watch out for to make sure that you have good controls and that they're operating at the level that you need them to operate at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good point here. All right. So when it comes to remote employees and third-party vendor application use, how important is it to define access privileges for both of them?
I think this is the lesson a lot of organizations have to take when they're going through the process of growth and potentially maturity in their IT security. The reality of it is when you do things informally, or when you do things in very simplistic ways that do not account for the needs of security, you're going to be potentially accidentally giving access to areas that you didn't intend to. And so really the best type of security and compliance starts with a good policy and a good, when it comes to access privileges, good documentation and good procedures that are then reviewed and audited and controlled in other ways. And so it's pretty significant that you need to spend the time to define your security groups, your access control, what has access to where and when and why, and what role or process in the organization they hold that requires them access to it. If you don't really spend the time to do that documentation piece and to really put it together in a comprehensive plan, there's a decent chance that you'll miss or forget something or open an unintended access. And so it is important to define them, and it's important to manage them and audit them as well.
So if it starts with the policy, let's say, for example, you go in and you're working with an organization. I'm assuming that you help them develop the policy and then put the procedures in place, because you would know much more so than they would as far as what should not be done.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes those conversations just need a third party in the room because one department head has a need, another has a need, and you need to help them sort out between them, or just basically changing the default organization of the file system to follow security lines and be built in a way that it's easier to not make mistakes. I mean, that's a real key element we've seen in a lot of organizations. They may have an intricate security design, but the way they've designed their file structure, not following groups, required a lot of permission changes downstream. So you might have permission to a folder and a different permission to some subfolder or object. You really want to avoid that if all possible, and reorganize your system to be much easier for an IT person or an administrator to assign somebody access and then not accidentally assign them to something else downstream they weren't supposed to. So a lot of this has to do with a significant consulting effort in order to reorganize access to things. That's just file systems as an example. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, having a good documented list of applications and the permissions and controls within them as well. It really is a work that can take quite a bit of time if your organization has some complex file systems or complex applications.
Yeah, I was just going to say this could get very overwhelming very easily. So having somebody by your side to help guide you with this would be a huge help. Help.
Breaking it down to bite-sized chunks that you can handle and taking it piece at a time with some guidance on how it works on the back end, because the folks that need to make these decisions are not IT people. They just know that they want to do security things, but they rely on their. It's got to be both the IT resources and the technical know-how working with the business managers and the business executives in order to make sure all the decisions hit correctly. It's definitely an effort.
Mm-hmm. And that a security measure you put in place is not going to completely hinder what someone is trying to do to get their job done. So that's
I mean, look, security needs to be there to protect, not to prevent people that are supposed to do their jobs from doing their jobs, right?
Right. All right. So MFA, we've talked about this. MFA, in previous interviews, we've gone over some things. And would this be another example of where MFA could be used?
Well, yeah, definitely. Look, controlling the authentication piece is always critical. When you're talking about remote working, I would not have anybody working remote and access to anything that doesn't have MFA included. And kind of I got into a conversation with a friend of mine this week who was talking about conditional access and saying, hey, was that the second factor? And just for those that don't know, it's like conditional access is where you might say, hey, I can access my Office 365, but I've restricted it only to the IP addresses of our office or our building. And therefore, is that a second factor? And the answer is no. Multi-factor is a very specific thing, specific to authentication, not where you're located or anywhere, but it is especially important that you're doing remote access when you're working remotely or working offsite, remote multi-factor with remote access, because it is one of the number one things you can do to prevent the most common types of attacks. I think it reduces the attack surface like something like 80%. It's crazy the amount of prevention you can get out of being diligent with your multi-factor authentication. Remote working, offsite, email, those are the key ones.
Yeah, and MFA these days is pretty easy. People that think, they get overwhelmed with that, thinking where it could be a simple thing as getting a text on your phone or a message on your phone or whatever, and you just click approve. Now, let me ask you a question. Yeah. If somebody has MFA on their device, does that cover everything if it's just on the device, or does it have to be on each of the different applications? Because if they can't get into the device, can they get into any of the other things?
Yeah, look, you can do something called single sign-on. So you can, through one authentication, authenticate to multiple things. So it just depends on how those applications are configured. But the reality of it is like, for instance, in our organization, we have multi-factor turned on for remote access. We have multi-factor turned on for all of our tools, especially since some of our tools don't require, they're available publicly or can be available publicly, and therefore secure authentication is required. And so there are different answers to that depending on the setup. But in general, I don't think you can have too much MFA. But if you do want to make it more convenient, as long as the applications support a single sign-on or SSO scheme that you can configure and set up, you can produce a situation where one authentication gets you to multiple places, and that makes it more convenient for the user while maintaining security. But short of that, MFA should be anywhere you have protected or secure or privileged data, anywhere.
All right, here's another thing. There's lots and lots of zero trust, big buzzword nowadays. So let's talk about zero trust and the mindset as it relates to CMMC. So how do you think zero trust fits into securing remote situations or environments?
Well, I think zero trust is just a recognition of the ubiquitous access of the internet now. It's so fast, it's so everywhere, and you really can do things from anywhere. And the attacks that are available coming in through the internet and such access is more dangerous than ever, more complicated than ever. There's more options for people to try to find their way in than ever. And so the concept of zero trust is a really sound one. I think that everybody should have some type of zero trust architecture initiative in their organization if they haven't already begun one. And remote working is one of the prime cases for a great place to implement zero trust. Break down some of the old VPN mindsets for access and bring in the new ZTNA, zero trust network access, can really bolster the security. And the good news, it improves the performance from the end user's perspective. So it's kind of a win-win. But, look, I think the old notion of having DMZs in your network is dead, because it pretends that somehow it's important that there's behind the firewall in the DMZ in public. When the reality of it is, you have to defend on all fronts today. All of them are dangerous. Separation and segmentation is still good and helpful. I'm not trying to say that's not the case. But the point is you have to take everything from the perspective of its vulnerability, and it just does not matter where that resource is. And so what people would have traditionally done with a DMZ network, really you should be thinking about putting in its own world, maybe in a cloud resource that's secure, or fully separating in some way. And when you think about people working offsite, zero trust networking access is definitely a more secure and a more compliant way to go.
So for everybody out there, can you just explain what DMZ is, just in case somebody is trying to...
Oh, yeah. Demilitarized zone, as it's called. And a lot of times if you're hosting something, say at your office building, and you have a server room or a server closet or something like that in your building, a traditional old school approach would be that you would set up certain servers to be accessible in a segmented network that is commonly known as DMZ, separated out from the rest of your network, your local area network. Therefore, public access into your environment would be routed. If somebody who's outside looking come in, would have to go to some server or resource in the DMZ before they could get access anywhere else. And ideally, that meant that you had good separation and security. That meant an external person couldn't make their way into the internal network, but only maybe as far as the DMZ, that separate, special segmented network. Mm-hmm. But these days, that's not very meaningful. Really, anywhere an endpoint is, anywhere a phone is, anywhere a computer is now like the equivalent of the perimeter. Internet access is so available, tools are so available that really anything can be vulnerable. You can't assume that the LAN is protected and the DMZ is your only risk point anymore. Mm-hmm. Anywhere can be risky and should be thought of as such.
All right, so here's a good question. So what are some solutions out there that can help with securing remote work environments?
Well, I think some of the key things are looking at ZTNA solutions. There are some up and coming that are really great out there that we're working with that we're pretty fond of. There are also some good solutions that you can implement for your multi-factor authentication to integrate with those solutions. You also need to have the standards in places like, advanced endpoint protection with the EDR or MDR functionality. You really can't move without that anymore. And you need to have your devices that are outside your network still protected by your content filtering. Traditionally, a lot of security tools will only do content filtering when you're behind the firewall in the office. You take that laptop home and you don't have those same security in your filtering. And so having good endpoint protection or good filtering tools on your devices as they're external is helpful. Two-factor authentication, implementing application control, another zero trust architecture where on the individual machine, nothing can be allowed to execute without it being expressly permitted to do so. That can really reduce the risk of something entering somebody's home computer and then finding its way into your network if that device is protected by application control. And then, as always, you really can't take the security of your firewalls too seriously. Having no ports open publicly, and if you do have some that are highly restricted and highly cordoned off so that they're very difficult to get to, and then configuring the firewalls with all the security. Once again, just this last week, we were doing an assessment for an organization, and this happens all the time. Their firewall is perfectly licensed for intrusion detection, IDS, and intrusion prevention, and yet it had not been configured by the folks that were managing that firewall. You just can't take some of that stuff too seriously. You need to be as vigilant as you can, because it is so much simpler for somebody to attack your network when you don't have the basic defenses in place, especially disappointing when you've already paid and licensed for the ability to do so, and it's just simply not configured.
That's why it's so important to make sure you're, especially if you're a non-technical business owner, that you have someone that absolutely positively knows what they're doing, who's handling your IT or your cybersecurity or any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And look, one of the things in CMMC and anything else that says, hey, you need to be getting penetration tests, you need to do vulnerability scans, you need to have audits running. Those are the things that are going to tell you if, you should have regular external scans of your firewalls done and see a report that shows what's open, what people can see from the outside, and internal scans and configuration reviews. These are all processes that an IT department should be handling, not only for compliance, but just general protection and security.
Mm-hmm. All right. So any additional best practices we can provide when it comes to securing remote environments and satisfying CMMC requirements?
Well, I think we talked about a lot of it. Obviously the MFA, looking at ZTNA products, least privilege, really restricting access. Those are the basic things. But, I think the biggest thing I see that people struggle with is they just jump in and start doing things without taking that first comprehensive kind of planning. And, sometimes they fail to recognize that their current staff might not be knowledgeable enough about these particular things. A lot of folks think an IT guy is an IT guy is an IT guy or gal. And the fact of the matter is there's different skill sets. And sometimes folks that are really great at working servers and desktops are not particularly great at CMMC compliance or particularly great at network security, zero trust architecture, or some of these other things around remote work. And that's where people typically get into trouble, is they're not getting a wide enough opinion, or they're not getting third-party assessments or other people taking a look at their environment to validate where their strengths and weaknesses are with their current IT solution, or their provider or their staff.
Yeah, and also making sure that the IT or whoever's handling it is staying on top of all the new things that come out. You can't just hire an IT company and then be like, whew, okay, we're done. They have to make sure that they're staying on top of it.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's internal team or IT staff, the reality of it is a lot of IT operates in kind of a firefight mode. And so they oftentimes don't get the training in. And so that's a great question. Do you ask yourself, am I providing the right and relevant and current training for my IT staff? Or does my IT provider, can they show me all the great training initiatives and evidence of good training happening with their people? I could tell you, in our organization, we had over 300 certifications passed last year. I'm very proud of that number, but I can tell you that we're unusual in that regard. We don't see that often. And it took us a long time to figure out how to get that done while still being very busy doing IT work. But it's one of those things that you just can't do enough of, in my opinion. And it's, look, IT changes every 2 years in significant ways, and you have to keep up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that is a big thing, 300 certifications. Good for you. Congratulations.
Yeah. Well, some of our vendor things, some various things, but look, it's a big number. We're excited about it.
Absolutely.
But it's a lot of hard work, and it's a lot of look, others are doing great as well. The point is you should be able to go to your IT team and really get them on training initiatives, or go to your IT service provider and really see exactly the training they're doing and what those subjects are, so you can get a real feel for what their skill set is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent point, and good questions to be asking them. So, Karl, that was awesome. I'm really happy we finally covered this topic, which we probably should have done a while ago. So I'm glad we got to it.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank everybody for watching. And we will see you on the next episode of 123 CMMC. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah.